In some ways, this is a video I probably should have made and shown you before or at the very beginning of the course. But since we're devoting this week to Civil War fiction, maybe this would be a good time to stop and think about just what happened after the Civil War and what things went on during the Civil War that impelled the movement in literature and politics and people between 1865 and about 1917. So I'm going to be covering a lot of ground in here, and I'm going to try to do it very quickly, and it's going to be a little superficial. If you want to know more about this, where I would recommend you spend your time is in the introduction to our textbook, where it takes us from 1865 to about the end of the 19th century, and it talks about the rise of realism and naturalism. Many of the same topics and some of the same facts that I'm going to talk about are in that section. So if you'd like to know more, that's a good place to start. The Civil War is something that we don't seem to have ever quite gotten over as a country. If you were looking at pictures of people who invaded the Capitol building on the 6th of January, you'll notice that several of them were carrying Confederate flags, as if somehow the war between 1861 and 1865 hadn't quite ended yet. And I think for some people, the kinds of issues that were raised by the Civil War are issues that are still with us today, although in a slightly different form. Just to give you an idea, a little bit of the kind of what was going on, the issue, of course, is slavery. And of course, there are a lot of other people who would say, well, it was really about states' rights or about this or the role of the federal government and stuff. Fundamentally, the issue was the expansion of slavery in the United States. And we could go through a tremendous amount of early 19th century American history where we look at the expansion of slavery and all of the new states that came in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. The issue of slavery was the single biggest thing that animated the federal government and for many of the people in the United States. Missouri, as you know, was admitted to the United States as a slave state. Kansas, the state next to us, was allowed to make its own choice under what was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what that precipitated in the 1850s was a civil war in the state of Kansas, in which many Missourians, slave-owning Missourians, participated, trying to force the people of Kansas to reject the idea of being a free state and, in fact, adopt slavery. Missouri, as you may or may not know, was the only state that had a star in each flag during the Civil War. As I mentioned in the Twain video, Missouri actually had 3 state governments. The St. Louis area was essentially a military district run by the Union Army. Southern and western Missouri was a Confederate leaning area. It had its own governor. And the middle and northern parts of the state, where there were fewer slave owners, was essentially Union territory. So Missouri is a complicated place. It's referred to as a border state, but I think of all the border states, it's by far the most complicated. This map here shows you the Confederate states. The first group of Confederate states broke away from the Union after the election of Lincoln because they felt that his party was going to abolish slavery. Fort Sumter became a battleground in April of 1861 when Confederate batteries in Charleston Harbor fired on it, and Lincoln called for volunteers to guard the U.S. bases and arsenals in the South. And then the rest of the South broke away as a result of that call for volunteers because they felt they were being invaded by Northerners. But at the bottom of all this, of course, is the idea of slavery, and that the South wanted to stay a slave territory and that it wanted to expand slavery into new states as they came into the Union because they felt they would be outvoted by free states eventually, because states in the North had abolished slavery over the previous 60 years. Very complicated. Anyway, Civil War was an enormous upheaval. The population of the United States was about 1/10 what it is now. It's about 30 million people. Battle casualties in the Civil War were around 620,000. These are killed. The Civil War is unusual in that more people were killed than were wounded. Okay, and that actually has to do with medical care and with military technology in the period. They had very deadly bullets that had, but the tactics that people used really haven't changed since the Revolutionary War, when the weapons were nowhere near as lethal. Basically, units would just line up 50 yards apart and shoot at each other until one side collapsed or withdrew. 476,000 people were wounded, and a total of around 400,000, this is for both Union and Confederates, were listed as missing or captured. And captured people were eventually returned, unless they died in captivity, to their homes. But there were still a substantial number of those who did die. If you go to Rock Island, for instance, in Illinois, you'll see an enormous cemetery. They're full of Civil War Confederate graves, and those are Confederates who died in captivity at a prison camp at Rock Island. There is a cemetery in Alton, Illinois, that also has Confederate prisoners in it, because there was a prison camp there as well. St. Louis held a number of Confederate prisoners throughout the war. Mainly because of its location, right on the Mississippi, not too far from the junction with the Ohio, and slave states underneath it, and of course parts of the state itself in rebellion. What's interesting about this is this would be equivalent to 6 million deaths in battle today. Okay, the total number of American casualties in combat is about 1.6 million. 1.2 million. Half of those are Civil War casualties. No war in American history has been so destructive, and no war in American history was fought exclusively on its own soil in this way as the Civil War was. Even parts of the Revolutionary War were fought in the Caribbean and fought in Canada, but only the American Civil War was fought entirely within the boundaries of the United States. It's hard to imagine the level of carnage that went on. Just to give you a couple other points of comparison, there were around 600,000 Confederate soldiers total during the Civil War, and around 1.6 million federal troops, of whom 180,000 were called U.S. colored troops. That is, these were African Americans. Some were free men, some were slaves, who joined the Union Army and fought as infantrymen during this period of time. Okay, one of the great centers of U.S. colored troops was actually here in St. Louis, because so many slaves escaped north and ended up in St. Louis that finally the Army organized them into units and began to use them as soldiers. Okay, during this period of time, if we look at this period, people, men in particular, tended to either be in the war or not in the war. They avoided service or they didn't. There was a draft finally imposed in the North in 1863 that actually caused a number of riots, because, especially in New York City, where Irish immigrants felt that they were being called up to fight for African Americans, and they felt that this was a terrible injustice. They had no respect for Black people, and no interest in the institution of slavery. The South imposed conscription about the same time, and when that happened, a number of men left the South and moved to the West. There is some speculation that Mark Twain is one of those. He does, serve for a short time in a Confederate irregular unit, and then he goes west when his brother is appointed as secretary to the governor of the Nevada Territory. And there are estimates that, between a quarter and a third of Southern men left the South during the Civil War to avoid being conscripted. In the North, a number of men bought their way out. If you were drafted, you could pay $300 and you wouldn't have to serve. Or you could find somebody who could be what they called a substitute. You could find somebody who would agree to serve in your place. And there were people who would do this. They would hire immigrants, they would hire older men to basically go out and take their place. It was an extraordinarily corrupt system. I'll let you think about that for a little bit. But if you think about it, we have a couple of Civil War veterans in this period. There's Twain, who serves, as I said, in this irregular unit. There's Bierce, Ambrose Bierce, and I have a separate video about both of these folks, who serves in the Union Army pretty much throughout the war, and is wounded, in fact, very seriously. In 1864. Walt Whitman, we could consider a Civil War veteran because he served as a nurse in Washington, D.C. He was older than any of the writers in this week, so it would have been extremely unlikely for him to serve in combat. Whitman's brother did, and that's actually what brought Whitman to being a nurse in Washington. He moved to Washington to take care of his brother and then stayed on as a nurse throughout the war. We also have a couple of other writers in this period who are of age to serve, but they don't. One of those is William Dean Howells, who we'll read this week. He spends the war as the U.S. consul in Venice because he had done the Republican Party a favor during the 1860 election. He wrote a campaign biography of Lincoln. And Henry James, who is next week's author, was also of an age, but he did not serve because he had a physical injury of some kind that precluded him from serving, although many people have argued that maybe he wasn't really wounded at all and he just didn't want to do it. And because he came from a reasonably wealthy, prominent family, he was able to get away with not serving. But the story of William Dean Howells, the story of Henry James, is not uncommon. There was not a massive rush to the colors, especially as the war went on. As it got longer and bloodier, it was harder and harder to find manpower. The Northern Army grew, in fact, mainly because of immigration, that many immigrants would come to the United States, and then if they were male and they were of an age and they were reasonably sound, would find themselves in the Union Army. There were German-speaking divisions and regiments. In fact, some of those were raised here in St. Louis. There were entire divisions of Irish soldiers, because that was a huge immigrant group that came here during this period, and many of them served in the Civil War. My great-grandfather, in fact, joined the Union Army after the war in 1867 and served for 5 years in the cavalry in the West. And he had come straight from Ireland, and that was the first job he got, was being a soldier. So many of you might have similar stories in your family histories. After the Civil War, the South is devastated. I mean, its economy is ruined. There's plantations are simply not economically viable, and there's a massive amount of unemployment. And you have this really complicated issue of suddenly having all the slaves free. The economic engine of the South was slave labor, and now all these folks are no longer slaves. This was a huge shift in capital because these people were property. They could be bought and sold. Entire fortunes were based on how many slaves people owned. Here in St. Louis, for those of you who are kind of interested, the French, the old-timey French families were slave owners. The Germans and the people from New England who controlled finance and a lot of the industry in St. Louis were not slave owners. And so after the Civil War, the French in St. Louis really lose their prominence in St. Louis society because they just don't have the money anymore. I mean, it's like, basically taking, this is a tough thing to imagine, but human beings are kind of like a bank account. And once they're not there, you're bankrupt because they can't be bought and sold. Well, some really interesting things happen. The first thing is the South is occupied as a military government for a number of years until about 1868. And states are admitted to the Union as they can put together a legislature and they can elect representatives. And in those days, state legislatures appointed senators. So what happens is that there's a mix of black and white congressmen for the first time ever. We tend to think of black congressmen as being a phenomenon from the 1960s, perhaps during the Civil Rights era, but that's not true. The first ones came in during Reconstruction, and for a few years, there were black representatives in Congress. This is a very famous lithograph of 6 of the 7 congressmen who were African American. Some of these were free men before the war. Some of these were slaves who were able to put themselves in a position where they could be elected. By some estimates, there were 2,000 black office holders in the South in federal, state, and local elections. But this doesn't last very long. The 1876 presidential election is split. It goes to the House of Representatives. It's between Tilden and Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes. And the price to get southern states to support Hayes is the promise of the federal government to end Reconstruction. And so that's what happens. And suddenly all the laws that are in place to guarantee equal rights of black and white people and to give them the vote begin to disappear. And slowly over time, state legislators in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, after 1876, began to enact more and more restrictive legislation to put African Americans back into a condition that looks an awful lot like slavery. So this is a short-lived but very important phenomenon, this notion of having black representatives in Congress. The flip side of the coin, of course, is that it causes this tremendous reaction by white Southerners that leads to the Jim Crow laws that exist in the South from the 1880s until the 1960s. And St. Louis, of course, is not immune to this. Schools in St. Louis were segregated, as they were in many states in the country, until the 1960s. And of course, many people would argue that we still have a legacy from these Jim Crow laws here in the United States, in the way we think about African Americans, in the way that there are certain parts of like St. Louis, for example, that are predominantly African American and others that are predominantly white. And these patterns go back to what happened during the Civil War and its aftermath. It's complicated. We could go on for days about as the South is going through Reconstruction and what's the rest of the United States up to? Well, there's this huge industrial boom. The Civil War really accelerates the growth of American industry. And this continues after the Civil War. We become the low-cost provider of goods and services, mainly because we have a huge labor pool that comes from immigration. We also have massive natural resources that come from coal, iron. We have gold in California, gold and silver in Nevada, eventually in the 1890s, gold from Alaska. And we become an extraordinarily rich country. What's interesting is that we also have like no regulation in this period of time. There are no unions, there's no pollution laws, there's all kinds of capitalism or capitalist enterprises, but there's no rules. Basically, there's no rules at all. And so what happens is that just like you would think, rich people become very rich, successful entrepreneurs become even richer, there's no income tax. And so there's this sort of this unbridled capitalism that's extraordinary in terms of creating jobs, of creating industries all over the country, especially in the Northeast, the Midwest, and eventually in the South. But that doesn't really happen until after the First World War. But pretty soon, power becomes held by a small number of people. And if you look up here, this is actually how people looked at Congress in this period of time. That you have all these little legislators, but they're really just doing the bidding of big industry, of big business, of the steel, the coal, the iron, the railroad industries. That basically Congress is doing nothing to interfere with the extraordinary capitalist enterprises that these guys are creating. But there's a cost, of course, and we see a little bit of this cost down here, where we have all these little poor people over here on the right-hand side that you probably can't see all that well. And then we have all these rich people over here. And these are all actually members of these different trusts. This is the Vanderbilts, the Jay Goulds, the financiers of the period of time. And so this becomes a really interesting kind of exercise in inequality, which leads to a tremendous amount of labor unrest in the 1880s and 90s, and the rise of unions, which is ruthlessly suppressed by these capitalists during this period of time. And of course, if you think about it, this sounds an awful lot like some aspects of our own time, where we have very rich and powerful people influencing the legislatures in both the state and federal government to do things that they want. And maybe that leaves the rest of us behind. What's interesting is that this makes the United States as a country see itself as a world power. And suddenly we're like the big guys. We are challenging the British, we're challenging European powers to become kind of the primary economy on the face of the earth. That doesn't really happen until the 20th century, but in the 19th century, we begin to see ourselves as the equal of any European power. We no longer see ourselves as the agrarian, small farmer, artisan kind of society that we saw ourselves after the Revolutionary War. We see ourselves very differently. Okay, a couple of interesting things that happen in this period of time. First is 1876, Little Bighorn. It's the first time the Indians defeat the cavalry in a pretty profound kind of way. And we could go on for hours about how the United States has treated Native Americans, but for our purposes, at this point, we just need to know that Little Bighorn unleashes an extraordinary campaign to wipe out or to contain all the Indian tribes in the West. And that ends in 1890 with the Battle at Wounded Knee, which is a massacre of Indians by American soldiers. 1890 is also the year that the U.S. Census Bureau finally says there's no more frontier. We are done with this. We're done with the period of westward expansion. We're done with the moving immigrants to the West Coast and building farms and things like that. It's over. We're basically one united geographical entity from the East Coast to the West Coast. Well, another thing that happens, of course, in 1898 is the Spanish-American War, and this is where the United States willingly decides to fight a war against Spain over the island of Cuba and over the sinking of a battleship, the USS Maine, that sank mysteriously in Havana Harbor in 1898. Later scholarship has established that the Spanish had nothing to do with this, but instead there was simply an explosion in the coal bunkers aboard the ship, which were notorious fire hazards, and the ship literally blew itself up. It had nothing to do with the Spanish. However, this gave an excuse to newspapers in the United States to argue for a war against the Spanish, to take them out of the Western Hemisphere as a colonial power and substitute the United States. And that's what happens. We suddenly become, we fight a short war. We fight a battle in Cuba. We fight a battle in Manila in the Philippines. And we suddenly find ourselves the possessors of an overseas empire. After 1898, we, as I said, are now a colonial power ourselves. We have a piece of Cuba where Guantanamo Bay is. We still own that. In fact, there's still a U.S. Navy base there, and you know that that's where prisoners have gone since the beginning of the War on Terror. We also own the Philippines, which is a country we stay in until 1946. We get Puerto Rico, we get Guam, 2 U.S. territories that we still own, and we get some little islands as well. And we are, in many ways, the equivalent now of a European power. And we tend to think of ourselves in the beginning of the 20th century in that way. Well, in 1901, at the beginning of his second term, William McKinley, the president, is assassinated. McKinley is interesting. He's a Republican, as were many of the presidents in this period of time. Democrats were identified with slavery, and it was something they never overcame in the period of time after the Civil War. They were also identified with the South during this period of time. It's kind of the reverse of how we see it now, where Republicanism seems to be stronger in the South than it is in the Northeast or on the West Coast. At any rate, McKinley is assassinated by an office holder, a man who's seeking an office in his administration. He doesn't get it. And Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. So there's this enormous new energy pumped into the United States. Roosevelt himself is a Spanish-American War veteran. He raised a unit of cavalrymen that fought in the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba. Successfully. He was a very brave man and a very complicated man, but he becomes president for the next 8 years. But he does 2 things. One is he creates this enormous navy for the United States, the Great White Fleet that travels around the world and establishes its presence as a imperial fleet to challenge the British, the Germans, the French to say, hey, we're here too. Okay. My grandfather, the Marine, again, was a member of that particular fleet cruise. Okay. But at the same time, he begins to do some things in the United States to impose some brakes on capitalism. He breaks up the trusts, these enormous conglomerations of steel and coal and iron and railroad interests, and make them into smaller companies so that they can reduce the amount of power that one company has over the economy in the United States. He also creates a variety of regulations so that consumer products like food and drugs are safe. And this is when the Pure Food and Drug Act gets passed in 1912. So for the first time, things like milk can't be adulterated, food has to tell you where it comes from, things like that. This was an enormous change because before, people didn't trust their own food supplies or their drugs. You could get all kinds of weird patent medicines and stuff that may or may not do what they say. But finally, as a result of Roosevelt's reforms, things begin to change. The country begins to assume the kind of regulatory structure that we kind of take for granted. This also coincides with what's called the progressive era in the United States, when there's kind of a general movement away from single party politics and more of a concern for letting people make their own choices. The most interesting piece of that is the direct election of senators. Until 1916, senators are appointed by state legislators. After that, they're elected, just like we go through every 6 years, we elect one of our senators. Okay, women's suffrage is an issue that comes up during this period of time. Women finally get to vote in 1920, but it's fought for all through this period of time. And of course, the one of the odder aspects of this is the idea of prohibition. And this is something that went back to the 19th century. There were these temperance movements where women mostly fought to reduce the amount of drinking that men did, because the idea was that men would get paid every week and they would just go drink up all the proceeds of their work, and then their family would not have any money. And so this began a movement that finally takes full flower in 1919 with the passage of what's called the Volstead Act that makes the production and consumption of alcohol in the United States illegal. And you've all seen the movies and the Eliot Ness stories and stuff from that period of time. But that lasts until 1933. It's a dismal failure. But it comes out of this movement of trying to improve the society in which we live. In 1913, another thing that comes out of the progressive era is the idea of income tax. And this is, again, designed to reduce the influence of fabulously wealthy people by reducing the amount of money they have. We still, of course, have an income tax, and the basis for it comes from the 16th Amendment. 1917, things begin to change. We enter World War I. Again, at this point, world power, we have our own colonies. World War I starts in 1914 in Europe, and after 2.5 years, the United States enters the war after the sinking of American ships and something that's called the XYZ telegram, where the German government goes to the Mexican government and says, hey, we'll give you back Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California if you join the war against the United States and attack the United States. I'm just saying. And so that's the impetus for the Americans to enter the war in April of 1917. My grandfather, as I think I've mentioned before, was a Marine from 1905 to 1945, and he was a captain in the Marine Corps in World War I in France, and that's where he met my grandmother, who was the daughter of a French Army officer. And frankly, I would not be here if it weren't for the First World War. Well, what does all this history mean for literature? In this period of time, there's a rise of what's called realism and naturalism, and this is kind of the take that our textbook takes on this period. That before the Civil War, fiction and poetry tended to be more romantic, that it tended to be more like its British antecedents, like the Romantic poets or the novelist Walter Scott. Who was the most popular 19th century novelist, was Sir Walter Scott. You may have heard of his book Ivanhoe, that's a medieval romance. This was the most popular novel in America until the Civil War. And what happens after the Civil War is there's suddenly a concern with realism, with writing fiction and indeed writing poetry that reflects the reality of people's lives. Um, there's no sentimentality in the literature in this period. If there is sentimentality, like in the character of Editha, it's made fun of. She's seen as clearly morally uh, bankrupt in many ways as a character. Other characters in this period of time are morally ambiguous, and certainly the characters we see in the Ambrose Bierce story, and indeed even in Mark Twain's Private History of a Campaign That Failed, are complicated characters. They're not all good guys. They're not all bad guys. Okay. Um, you see realistic settings. You see realistic plots. There's no sort of fictional pixie dust that's scattered to make things happen. We see books about the business and industrial structures of the period, particularly when we look at Howells. A later writer we're going to look at, Gilman, is a woman who's writing about the psychiatric practices of the period that are used to hold women into place. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a really interesting character that we'll get to, but she writes realistically about this role that women suddenly find themselves in and how men regard them. Race as something to be written about, we'll see with people like Paul Laurence Dunbar and W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the great black writers of the period. And we'll see how they respond to changes in the politics that has to do with the role of African Americans in both the North and the South. Okay. And suddenly we start to see the country as it really is. We don't see it necessarily as the idealistic kind of place that pre-Civil War writers do. We see it as a place where there's real conflict, where there's real class concerns, where there's a lot of moral ambiguity, in the sense that figuring out what's the right thing or the wrong thing to do becomes extraordinarily complex. During this period, towards the end of it, there's a time when what's called naturalism begins to appear. And these are writers that we won't necessarily be reading directly, but these are people who write about how people are caught up in these forces of class or politics or economic strife, and how they just fall apart, about how they have to kind of sort of grub their way through and terrible things happen to them. Probably the classic naturalist work of fiction is a book by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle, that some of you might have heard about. And that's a story about an immigrant who works in the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the early 20th century, and how dehumanizing that experience is, and how he's just as much of a machine as any of the machines that are used to process the pigs and the cattle and the chicken that are being processed into food products in this period of time. He's also seen, the hero of the story is seen as kind of an animal just as much as the animals that he is butchering and processing. He himself is seen to become an animal and less of a human over time. And so if you get interested in that, there's some extracts in our textbook from naturalistic writers, but I've decided not to devote much time to them because they're a relatively small part of American fiction, important though they are. At the same time that this is going on with realism and naturalism in the United States, some writers punch out, some writers move overseas, and we'll be dealing with one of those, Henry James, in a week or so. There are also American writers who spend most of their time in the U.S. but travel to Europe and stay there for months or even years at a time. People like Mark Twain, who were reading during the Civil War week, and Edith Wharton, who we'll read later in the period. There's also a movement where hundreds of women from wealthy families, those capitalists that I told you about earlier, suddenly start looking to Europe for husbands. They have all the money they need because they're heiresses. They have all these vast fortunes that their fathers have created, but now they want to have a title. They want to be a duchess or a countess or some kind of nobility. And so they go to Europe and they look for eligible men who come from noble families who have a title that they can inherit. And Edith Wharton writes a book about these women called The Buccaneers, because that's the term that was used a little derisively in the 19th century. These were women who would leave the U.S., this was in the 1880s and 90s, go to Europe, spend a summer, look for a guy who needed money but who had a title, and then they would marry him and bring him back to the United States. And these were kind of like trophy husbands, if you can imagine that. Well, I know we talk a lot these days about trophy wives, but It's not just women who were trophies. Men could be trophies too. The three paintings I have here are kind of interesting. This is from Thomas Hart Benton, a Missouri artist, a realist, who, if you look at this painting, shows you kind of a collision of two different cultures in the West. This was a real train wreck, but you see the railroad and horses kind of colliding. And this, to me, kind of encapsulates this period as we're moving from sort of one notion of ourselves, sort of a horse-drawn, simple agrarian life, to a much more industrialized, mechanical life, one that's dominated by engineers and big business rather than by farmers. And this painting kind of encapsulates that. This is a painting by the German artist Thomas Anschutz. These are iron workers in Philadelphia. And this comes from a period of painting called naturalism. And so it gives you an idea of sort of the power of individual men here to be part of this system of factories that created so much. It's probably a little hard to see because of the webcam in the way, but this is a painting called The Gross Clinic. And let me turn this off. See if I can get it out of the way. Yeah, and this is William Gross. He's an anatomist, and this is how you went to medical school back in the 19th century. You would watch a surgeon or a group of surgeons do dissections or do procedures on cadavers if it was a dissection, and actually trying to fix something. In this case, if I remember right, they're doing a lung. They're taking out a diseased lung, and so this becomes a medicine in this period of time becomes really interesting as there's more advances in surgery, advances in anesthesia, and advances in antisepsis and using antiseptics to make sure that you don't get infection. Most of the drugs we have don't exist in this period of time. But there's still a move even in medicine to make it more efficient and more comfortable for the patient. This painting, by the way, is one of my favorites. It's huge. If you ever go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is famous from the Rocky movies, this is one of the paintings that's there. This painting, the Anschutz painting, I think is also there. If you want to see a lot of Thomas Hart Benton paintings, his studio's in Kansas City, you can visit it. And you can also go to the Missouri State Capitol where he did all the murals. This is the last slide, and I'm sure you're glad to hear that. What follows realism and naturalism is a period that we call modernism. And this begins just before the First World War, and it lasts until maybe the end of World War II, maybe a little longer than that. Modernism is a period, it's kind of a response to this mechanization that starts in the 19th century. It's also a reaction, as it develops over time, to the extraordinary amount of death that happens in the First World War. The United States loses a relatively small number of soldiers in combat in the First World War because we're there for a very short time. What really affects the United States is the Spanish flu, which was an epidemic not unlike the COVID epidemic that we're in the middle of. Only in those days, literally millions and millions of people were killed. There's estimates that worldwide up to 50 million people died after the First World War because of the Spanish flu. Both my grandparents contracted the Spanish flu and recovered, as did many people from the period, but the numbers were extraordinary, how fast it was transmitted, how many people died, and how many people died very quickly. It's hard to imagine the impact of that. Imagine something like the COVID thing 10 times worse in 18 months, okay, because that's how long the Spanish flu epidemic lasted here in the United States. It was the most devastating pandemic we've ever had. Well, as we see death on an industrial scale, both in combat and in disease, people begin to look around and say, well, where do I fit in? Where does the individual fit in? How does an individual human being make his or her way in a world that is so profoundly mechanized and structured in a way where an individual human is meaningless, utterly meaningless? If you look at Walt Whitman's poetry, for instance, this just popped into my head. If you look at Whitman and you look at his poetry, it's all about the celebration of the individual, about how powerful that individual sense of self is in organizing the way that that figure looks at the world around him and how he seems in control of his environment. Well, modernism is kind of the mirror image of that. It's how does an individual assert control over him or herself in a context where that is impossible. Okay, so what happens? Um, Language becomes kind of the arbiter here. And when we get to poets like Eliot and Pound and Frost and William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens later in the course, you're going to see that there's a focus on particulars, a focus on individuated experience, on unique perspectives. And at the same time, there's also a sense of mining past forms and past language to see if that kind of value structure that existed 2, 3, 400, or in Pound's case, 1,000 years before in Anglo-Saxon literature, whether that has any meaning in the context of this new society that we live in. Okay, and many people also look at modernism as sort of an extension of naturalism, as a focus less on the individual being caught up in society structures that hold that person back, but rather a focus on the individual as an individual in that context, and seeing him or her less as a type, which is certainly how naturalistic fiction sees them, as victims, but how do you see them trying to assert control in that period of time? And we'll see what happens. Like I said, this is a very quick and dirty, although I know you probably think this has gone on way too long. This is a very complex period. There's kind of an arc here that starts at the end of the Civil War and sort of comes to full circle, or comes to its logical conclusion, maybe by the end of the Second World War. And so this kind of structure is going to animate what we're going to be doing for the rest of the course. Thank you very much for your patience. I look forward to answering your questions over the next few weeks.